Urbanization-sensitive programming is drawing our attention to the drastically transforming context of our interventions. Urbanization is changing the game altogether, and if we want to make it to work for us rather than against us, then we need to be very conscious and proactive about it. We need to urbanize our own thinking. All our programs in health, education, economic development, peace building, governance are all affected because urbanization changes everything. Urbanization is happening anyway, whether we like it or not. Our only choice is whether we want to ignore it, in which case we risk that it comes and bites us, by us becoming inaccurate, irrelevant, not to the point. Or we can try to make urbanization work for us by actively addressing it and taking it into consideration. We have found 10 fields which allow us to pin down that transformation of context. And I'd like to walk you through those 10 fields. The first field is spatial data and information. We need to get an accurate understanding of the locations and the spaces in which we are working. And for that, we need data and information which is geo-referenced, which is geolocated, where we understand how information is attributed to a particular space so that we can analyze that space, so that we can understand space in its morphology. But more importantly, maybe, the question is who is owning and interpreting this data and this information. And we need to find ways that local people can own their own data and information. The second field is that cities are economic engines. Through effects like agglomeration effects that happen when a lot of dynamics, a lot of activity, a lot of people and infrastructure come together in a small space, we find certain positive effects in terms of efficiency. And we need to see how we can leverage those effects in terms of efficiency, those agglomeration effects, for the good of development. The third field that we need to look at is intensification. Through the concentration, and only through the concentration, through increasing density, can we manage to have ever-growing populations being sustained and serviced and supported without having all the natural space disappearing. Densification is the only way to have growing populations live alongside with actually also growing intact natural spaces. The fourth field we need to look at is spatial justice. Leaving no one behind also, and maybe particularly, means leaving no space behind, because people are also distinguished and differentiated by the places where they live, where they work, where they interact socially, economically. Spatial justice also includes having access to the city, the right to be in the city and to shape the city, to produce the city that you are part of or that you depend on, even if you're not living in the city. So that is a dimension of equity and inclusion that we need to pay particular attention to in the context of urbanization. The next field is informality. Informality is so prevailing, so dominant, so successful in many ways in terms of filling vacuums all around us, because it is incredibly flexible, it's very dynamic, and it manages to kind of accrue even most marginal profits and opportunities. So a lot of people depend on those advantages of informality to make a living. In fact, more than benefit from formal systems. Of course, there are downsides to informality, but we need to see how we can leverage the upside, the advantages, the real strengths of informality, and at the same time deal with its negative sides. The next dimension is accessibility. Having access to basic services, to economic opportunities is quintessential for an inclusive and equitable society. And that accessibility does not only mean mobility, for instance, transport, the possibility to get somewhere, but it also includes other things, like, for instance, social policy or cultural habits of who can or is allowed to go where. Or it also includes spatial planning, land use planning. What do we put where so that it gets accessible in an inclusive and in an equitable manner? The next dimension is land. Land is a critical factor in terms of creating and shaping livelihoods. People live on land, they work on land, they interact on land, and the value of that land is transforming and changing constantly. And it is creating, on the one side, desires and claims, for instance, to harness, to harvest, to yield increasing land value. But we can also use increasing land value to subsidize and finance all sorts of public goods. But it also has, as a shadow side, issues around corruption or rent seeking, which we need to take into consideration. So land is a very important factor, and urbanization is driving the importance of that. The second last field is transactions. This is particularly important in the urban-rural continuum, because those are the links between different communities, different systems. Transactions are not only value chains or production chains, but they are also links in terms of information flows. They are family or social bonds, and a lot of other dimensions. There are transactions, economic transactions, remittances, trade, and. And all of these transactions provide both their own challenges, but also the opportunities to make them more effective, more inclusive, and more equitable. And lastly, urbanization is kind of, on the one side, the cradle of a lot of innovation. Through the densification and intensification, through the meeting of minds, of opportunities, and we see a lot of innovation happening. But at the same time, urbanization, in order to realize positive impacts in all these fields that I've mentioned, also depends on innovation and new ways of doing things and technologies. So these are the 10 dimensions that we'd like to look at more intensively in order to make our programming urbanization sensitive.